Welcome to the Dark Ozarks. We are diving into dark forests and magic trees. Specifically, what dark things lurk in the Mark Twain National Forest that spans 1.5 million acres in southern Missouri. We will get back to all the scary things in the Mark Twain Forest in a minute. But first, we want to remind you that the Dark Ozarks podcast is now available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, or just about any other podcast platform. So what happens in the Mark Twain Forest that scares you?
Well, besides the people who disappear and are never heard from again, they're the UFO encounters, Bigfoot, werewolves, and the Missouri Mystery Mound.
Let's not forget that an entire colony disappeared there as well, and the Trail of Tears went through what is now the Mark Twain National Forest.
There's been a lot of things happen there that was very dark, and some of those things are very hard to explain. And of course, it's up to everyone to decide what really happened. And then there's the issue of witchcraft and the magic of the forest itself.
We will discuss what you thought was just a relaxing hike or camping trip in a second. But first, we want to invite everyone to follow, like, etc. Dark Ozarks on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. Plus, we encourage you to follow the podcast. While you are on Facebook, you can subscribe to the private Dark Ozarks subscribers group. Why, you may ask? Yes, it does have a small subscription fee, but you receive content that is exclusive and beyond the scenes where you don't find it anywhere else. It also helps us bring more original content to Dark Ozarks. You can click the subscribe button on the page. You'll have to log in since there is a payment, and we do appreciate everyone.
And now you can get Dark Ozarks t-shirts for sale at darkozarks.com and paranormalsciencelab.com.
We encourage everyone to check out Always Buying Books in Joplin, Missouri, in person and online, on Facebook and their website, alwaysbuyingbooks.com, for all of your reading needs, including a large section on the paranormal, history, and more, not to mention the building's haunted. Tell Bob and Elise that we sent you.
We also want to thank Beard Engine Brewing Company in Alba, Missouri. Beard Engine Brewing is the only English-style brewery in Missouri and has been twice named Missouri's best brewery by the Missouri Brewers Association. Great beer and food in a historical building with a noir past. And also, yes, the building is haunted. Tell Nate and Tiff that we sent you.
Dark matters in Mark Twain National Forest. I think probably one thing that comes to mind and makes a lot of sense to people are there are a lot of tales of Bigfoot and wild men.
Yes, there are, and for good reason. When you look at the spaces that we are dealing with.
Yes, and I think for people who are not very familiar with Mark Twain National Forest, it would make sense for us to describe the area a little bit, because it is a lot different than a lot of national parks.
It is. So if you're listening and you're not familiar with Mark Twain National Forest or Missouri or the south half of the state of Missouri, which point, if you have interacted with the Mark Twain National Forest, possibly not even knowing it, it is not like Yosemite or the Everglades or the Grand Tetons or Yellowstone, in the sense that south of the I-70 corridor, which stretches between St. Louis and Kansas City, there are, and very much within the Ozarks of Missouri, you have 9 massive disparate regions of the Mark Twain National Forest. And within this space, obviously forest, that pretty much should go without saying, but just for clarification, but within, woven throughout these sections, there are still your regular road infrastructure, homes, farms, ranches, these types of things. And so it is a very different situation than, pulling up to the the gate, one of the entrances into, for example, Yellowstone, which I grew up doing. And for
Same
the
here.
record, grew up doing this time of year. Don't ask. And
We weren't quite
there,
that brave. We did during the summer.
yeah, that is fair. That is very fair. The one and only week that I experienced minus 45 degrees Fahrenheit, not wind chill. Oh, December 1990 in Cook City, Montana.
Sounds
You
like
guys,
a lively time.
honestly, it was absolutely amazing, but it was the kind of cold that you just hear about.
Mm-hmm.
And I was a freshly turned 12 going, oh my gracious. We were in South Florida this time last year. What on earth have we done? But incredible memories, incredible scenery. On that note, also, for folks who are watching live tonight, we do want to wish you all a wonderful, safe, and festive winter solstice.
Yes, it is the solstice today, and uh, it seems very appropriate considering some of the things that have been going on today. So
I agree. And and the topics that we have tonight. And so in going over this, you'll find the signs alongside the road, typically large, nice signs that say you're entering Mark Twain National Forest, but you will not have the gatehouse and paying the fees to get in, and the welcome packet, and all of those things that we typically associate with national spaces.
Well, one way to put it is that instead of going into an area that is surrounded by quote civilization, you basically are going in and out of areas. And just because you're in the national forest doesn't mean that you don't have people living there day in and day out. It's not just people who are there working or they're visiting as tourists.
Right. Right. Which really tends to change. It does a couple of things. One, it changes the dynamic of the reports of strange activity.
Mm-hmm.
And in some cases, and I think as we dig into this more, many cases, it's individuals who are actually interacting with the forest on a regular basis, rather than simply being tourists.
And in that regard, I think those kind of reports, for me anyway, can have a lot more credibility in that often you're dealing with people who are there a lot, who are familiar with, what typically happens and the wildlife and, what you typically see in the sky, things like that. Whereas if you're, at a national park and you're 1,500 miles from home and you're there for a day or two, it's easier to mistake things that you're not familiar with.
It is. It is. And the term town people tends to show up. Now I'll leave it at that. But our massive sections include the Cedar Creek section, Salem Potosi, Fredericktown, Poplar Bluff, Doniphan, 11 Point, Rolla, or Houston Rolla, Willow Springs, Ava, and Cassville.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot of territory.
It really is. I mean, you from whether you are going east to west, south to north, etc., you are talking about hundreds of miles.
You are. And a lot of different features, but one of the standouts with the Mark Twain National Forest is that it is typically very, very rugged and
Mhm.
very, as the name implies, yes, it's a forest, but it's very densely forested, with a majority of hardwoods and a lesser percentage of shortleaf pine.
Yes.
And
And
weird stuff happens there.
yes, weird things happen and um have happened for a long time, I think is something too to note that you hear about some of this stuff more, I think, in the internet age, and some of it gets reported and regurgitated over and over, sometimes the same story over and over. And so it's sometimes if that's your source and that's where you're reading it, it can appear like, is this isolated or is this new? You know, is this stuff that's just started happening in the last 20 years? No.
No, it isn't. And especially with the logging that began in the 1880s,
Mm-hmm.
very important to understand that the forests of Missouri, with a few exceptions, were clear cut beginning in the 1880s to feed industry, in primarily the railroad infrastructure.
Right. Actually, most of the railroad ties for the railroads going from the Mississippi west actually came from the Ozarks.
Yes, which is both phenomenal and sad
Mm-hmm.
at the same time. And just as a little bit of an aside with the with the forests of the Ozarks, the virgin forest, virgin hardwood and shortleaf pine forest of the Ozarks existed since the Cenozoic era
Mm-hmm.
until 1880.
Yeah, then it's the no. And when we say it's a pretty rugged area and heavily forested, it is, but it would have been even more so before that point, which I think does lend to the pattern of stories for Sasquatch or Bigfoot, where so many people think of that as a Pacific Northwest Canadian uh, type thing. It really, we had forests that thick up until 140 years ago.
Yes, I think that's I think that's a very powerful observation. And with that, just the culture of the logging men, and I think it's very important. There are aspects of the clear cutting of the Ozarks that I lament for a variety of reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And there are still small sections of old growth Ozarks forest, but it is rare.
Right.
At the same time, the predominantly men, the loggers who went in to do this work, or either went in camps, or were the everyday men, still actually the indigenous quote unquote hillbillies who were living in the
Mm-hmm.
mountains, who were suddenly presented with the opportunity to actually make money that was consistent. That their work, their culture, their stories, their unbelievably dangerous and backbreaking work that they labored to ultimately create infrastructure that we take for granted. We drive across the country on infrastructure roads that follow railroads. The railroads were the precursor to our regular vehicular roads, and we cross bridges. We are oblivious to the train trestles. We are oblivious to all of these things. These things were things that incredibly hardworking individuals simply trying to make a living created.
Exactly. And these were some of the first people who encountered wild men or Bigfoot in the Ozarks. And actually, a couple of the earliest accounts are connected to two of the areas in the Mark Twain National Forest. First would be the Donovan 11 Point area, in that there were stories of wild men coming out of Missouri, going south into Arkansas after the New Madrid earthquake in 1811 to 1813. And people might find that a little odd, but there were 3 or 4 major earthquakes within a few days. And then there were 20,000 more earthquakes over the next about 15, 16 months. And shortly thereafter, there were reports of, quote, wild men showing up further south and believed to have come out of that area. And parts of the Boot Hill and extreme eastern Missouri through there, literally the subsidence was so great that you had cracks developed that were 40, 50 feet deep and that far wide, areas raised up 30 feet or sunk, parts of land that suddenly are underwater, that kind of thing. And so you started getting stories of these creatures that either men gone having lost all rationality and basically become feral, or some that really do sound like modern Bigfoot accounts.
They do. It can go either way, and you have to be prepared for the possibility that it might actually be hearing descriptions of 2 separate phenomena.
Yeah, actually, it could have been, to be perfectly honest, could have been 2 different groups that decided to leave the area after that.
Yes, and simply being shaken up to a large degree. It is difficult, I think, for us to now we're oblivious to the so much of the infrastructure that exists, but it's easy to also or difficult, I think, for us to wrap our heads around just how majestic and massive the pre-1880s forest was.
Yes, and that these things could happen. I mean, people, these kind of migrations happened, and people really weren't that surprised by it from all accounts. Another area of the national forest that is connected with Bigfoot accounts very early is actually the Ava area, and that would be the Blue Man.
Yes.
And there are reports of the Blue Man through the Ava area, around several counties in that area, and actually going down into Arkansas as well. But starting in the 1860s, and actually reported by some logging camps that they were, small scale logging and sawmills, basically to build the towns right after the Civil War, and to rebuild areas. And they reported in detail being attacked or chased by creatures that sound just like Bigfoot, very tall, very heavy, muscular, covered in hair. And there are 2 accounts of why they call him the Blue Man. One is that it's very dark fur that in the sunlight has a blue tint to it, blue hue. And the other is that one of the first loggers who reported seeing them, his nickname was Blue. So
Interesting.
who knows which it is, but ironically, typically there were a number of reports describing them as having, almost black fur that had a blue cast to it in the sunlight. So
Yes. And there's an interesting report that much more recent that seems to validate that. Something that one of the things about the Blue Man report that I really, really like is that it precedes the mid 20th century pop culture references of Bigfoot.
that's true. It's before basically the hype, or before Bigfoot became a household name.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of detail in those reports too, though, about behavior that is reported today.
Yes.
Throwing rocks, hitting trees with a stick or a limb. The bellowing, basically intimidation, trying to run them off of territory. And so when you read the accounts, it sounds like something that you read today.
It does. And with that, and I want to make sure that I clarify. I'm not dismissing the Bigfoot lore that has the anecdotal evidence and the reports and the Bigfoot lore that has expanded since the 1950s. That the thing that I really the issue that one always has to deal with is, and we see it more now with the internet, because copy and paste is a real thing, and it's trust me, I know, in terms of research. But you have this situation where, as when individuals who are attempting to do as the most grounded research as possible find one report, and then you simply don't know how much of that report has or has not been contaminated by popular culture.
That's true.
And that that contamination is once something enters into public consciousness, pardon me, once something enters into public consciousness, it's very, is the report that you're being given, is that something that someone genuinely saw, or did they see something that could be mistaken for that, and even unconsciously, not that they're trying to make something up, but that the Bigfoot reports, the popular culture expectation, its fur was this color, it moved this way, that the mind doesn't just fill in the blanks around it based on expectations we all have. Like, we all know what Bigfoot is supposed to look like. We all know what Bigfoot is supposed to move like. We've all seen clips of the video from the Northwest, Great American Northwest, these types of things. That's the thing that I love about this original Blue Man report, which interestingly enough does anecdotally mirror so many of the modern accounts, which I think is fantastic. Is a base of potential evidence. But we also know that the loggers and those who were writing these accounts in the 1860s and 70s were not culturally contaminated by pop culture expectation.
Exactly. And the, sort of the extreme opposite end of that spectrum is Rob Lowe, saying, reporting that he and his son were filming their show in Arkansas a few years ago and encountered Bigfoot. But I never heard any particular details. So actually, reading interviews he did, I never heard any particular details of behavior, exactly what happened, that would say, okay, it was very vague. I'm not saying
Yes.
it didn't happen, but you'd have to wonder.
Yes. Now, along those lines, just to dig into this particular aspect, there are quite a few online articles and quite a few YouTube videos dealing with Mark Twain National Forest and Bigfoot. And some of the reports are really, really interesting. Some of them are quite dramatic. And as part of this pop culture contamination, I want to be really clear when I say pop culture contamination. I'm not saying that the account is or is not true. It very well may have happened. I'm not saying that I'm, specifically disputing that that claim one way or the other. But you have these situations where, first of all, it simply says Mark Twain National Forest, and there is no further reference. I'm going, okay, which of the 9 gigantic sections scattered across the south half of the state are we referencing? Because
Exactly. They
they're
can be hundreds of miles apart.
yes, and and in some cases, depending on terrain, even with our modern infrastructure, close to a day's drive apart.
That's true.
And I know because I've done that.
Yeah, me too.
Let's just say once you get off the beaten path between Poplar Bluff and Donovan, it's a long way back to Hollister. And
I used to make the drive between Springfield and Donovan at least every other month, sometimes every month.
yes, you know some of the most beautiful country that you're ever going to see, if you can, take your eyes off of the road, because it's going like this.
Exactly.
I was and okay, so I'm originally, my ancestry is not Flatlanders, but I grew up in Flatland. And people who are Flatlanders, having discussions with, okay, how to get from this point to this point in an expedient way. And they're like, oh, just take that road. I'm like, no, do not just take that road. Not if you want to be there by the time that you need to be there.
That's right.
It does not work like that. But we have the scattering of dark things happening in the Mark Twain National Forest stuff, and then it's treating it like it's like that's simple enough to find.
Right.
And there's a lot there. There's way more than that. And so I'm always on the lookout for, okay, is this where guys? And the reports that I really like are the ones that say, okay, this is near Salem, this is near Bunker, this is near Willow Springs, this is near Donovan, these types of things. And that really helps to, of course, narrow the space down. There's one I want to deal with this one to start with, just because it is, and again, I'm not disputing the potentiality of the claim, but there's a pretty easily accessed story floating around out there of an individual who was camping and first of all, an individual named Bill camping in the Mark Twain National Forest. But this is a pretty classic example. On the other side of a cornfield, 20 to 25 feet away from the tent, hearing large grunts coming from what sounded like a bull. In the dark, apparently could only see a large, tall figure without detail, but believed in his mind it was absolutely a Sasquatch. He believed the creature did not like humans nearby at night. He fired 5 warning shots approximately 12 feet over the creature's head. That seems like a really bad idea. Led to even more growls and threatening sounds. Again, I think that was a very bad idea. He believes that there were many of those creatures in the woods. He spent the rest of the night sitting in his tent with his firearm, waiting for the sun to come up so he could pack up his tent and leave.
It's probably lucky that he made it to sunrise
Agreed.
after shooting.
And it is an interesting, to me, particularly interesting on this, because there's certainly plenty of individuals to provide logical structure for, the region could not support a lot of Bigfoot.
Right.
And yet there are a number of accounts that do seem to be disparate accounts that the individuals had a really strong impression that they were inadvertently dealing with a community of Bigfoot, not some sort of soul apparition.
Yeah, at least a small group, because a lot of the accounts really do describe hearing coordinated noise making and footsteps and so forth, almost as if one would be trying to draw attention in one direction while another would be sneaking, flanking them, that kind of thing, so that at least small groups cooperating with each other.
Yes. And if you are dealing with 8 to 10 foot tall, essentially Wookiees, if you are dealing with Wookiees
might be actually technically at our next topic.
Yeah, that it really wouldn't take that many. The concept of dealing with an highly intelligent, but of a completely different type of intelligent, 8 to 9 foot tall or 7 to 9 foot tall bipedal primate men.
2 or 3 can do quite a bit to terrorize.
It would not take too many to give you a really, really bad day.
Exactly. All you have to do is look at some of the guerrilla warfare from the Civil War and know how bad that could be. Subtract firearms and add, a lot more bulk and height.
And, I think that there are plenty of people to detract from the idea. If Bigfoot was real, we would have one by now. We would have found one deceased. Mm-hmm. Somebody would have shot one. Somebody would get a better photo of one, etc. And while all of that potentially is quite logical, I still think that it is arrogant to dismiss the potential and to dismiss all of these reports for 160 plus years just out of hand.
I think so. Plus, if you read articles by or documentaries with anthropologists and biologists in them discussing this, they often say they're not too surprised, because just think of the number of animals that are in a forest otherwise and how few remains are actually found. And so if you have a very small, if you have a relatively small population, that's not that inconceivable. Plus, if they are a social animal, presumably highly intelligent, higher primate, they could bury their dead as well.
Yes, which explains a lot. Now, we've got 2 really, to me, really interesting accounts that go beyond just the surface level artifice that we're dealing with. One of them is actually July 1967, Howell County, Missouri, near Willow Springs. And for me, that's a huge step in the right direction.
Me too.
And we have a really detailed account from an, at the time, 12-year-old girl, 12 years old in 1967, later as an adult, sharing this. And it is, to a degree, a little chilling, just in terms of the actual encounter. I have to step away for just a second, but if you'll share that, just the highlights of that, and then I'll be able to step back in.
Okay, I've got to find my particular notes.
Yeah, it's
I'm getting to.
and again, like I said, the fact that we're dealing with this with a date, a county near a city, these are really, really effective aspects. That's not saying that it couldn't be fiction,
Right.
but at the same time, it really strikes me as incredibly interesting. And again, in rural Missouri in 1967, we're not dealing with an environment that has been extremely contaminated by pop culture references, and I think that's
Very
really
true.
helpful. It's in the Bigfoot.
I found it.
Okay, great. If
Okay.
you don't mind sharing
Yeah,
some
no,
of
that's fine.
Okay.
And basically this lady, she is later on recounting this and saying that she's tried to, write it multiple times and had a hard time describing exactly what happened, and that she doesn't like to relive the event if it was very traumatic, but she can't forget it. So she's decided that she would share her experience. And I think that's one thing too, is that these experiences are often like people who have unexplained UFO experiences, or perhaps experiences with the paranormal. Sometimes they feel intimidated to share. But as she says, she was born and raised on a farm about 10 miles from the nearest town. It had a wooded area that was connected to the Mark Twain National Forest. And there was a neighbor friend that she played with as a child who lived about a half mile down a gravel road where they would walk back and forth between the houses. And this event happened when she was 12 years old. It was a summer evening, and I had walked up to my friend's house playing. It would soon be dusk and time for me to go home. I'd been taught to watch out for snakes, and I kept an eye out for wild animals. It was starting to turn dusk just as the old gravel road dropped off into a holler. It was a few shades darker in the holler, as both sides of the road were lined with trees and foliage acting as a canopy. I guess I was not paying attention as I knew I should have been. I was watching out for snakes because there always seemed to be more in that area. My dad had hunting dogs, and one always followed us around. I could smell the dog. It smelled like it had been down in the pond again. I could hear it walking along with me just a few feet off in the woods. I started calling the dog to come to me, but it did not respond. I thought that was odd. The road was coming up out of the holler, and I started to pay more attention to what was happening. I could finally hear the dog coming towards me. It stepped out of the woods onto the gravel road to my right and just behind me. The hair on my neck started to crawl. Something was not right, and I could feel it. I looked down and a little to my right, expecting to see the dog, but all I saw were two huge, hairy feet. Suddenly, I turned my head back towards the road and froze. My feet became rooted to the ground as a wave of fear washed over me. My mouth was as dry as a bone. I could not have uttered a word. Even though I was so frightened, I could not help myself. I had to look. I had to see what was standing next to me. I slowly turned to my right again, but this time I looked over my shoulder right into a hairy body. It was within arm's reach. As I lifted my eyes, they traveled up, as it was very tall. I saw nipples under a reddish thick hair. It was not fur. Finally, I was looking into a face. It was watching me very closely. The whites of the eyes were reddish and its pupils were a bluish color. I looked away and down at my feet. I did not know how I was going to get away from this creature. It was tall and stocky built. It could have killed me had it wanted to. I put one foot out slowly and walked as though I had rods tied to my feet. The distance from where I saw the creature in home seemed like an eternity. And paper stuck together. At last, I was at the door of home. My body was so tense it hurt to move. I was so afraid, but knew I had to look to check where it was, and it was still behind me. I could not allow this thing to enter my home, so I slowly turned my head to look behind me. I had only turned a little when I saw it standing down the drive a short ways. There was a cedar tree along the driveway, and its hand was close to the top of the tree. It still watched me, and then it just dropped to its hand, and in about 3 strides disappeared into the forest. I then cried out. It must have been a strange or horrible scream because my dad came running. I could barely talk to tell him what had happened. He knew something had happened, so he got his rifle and searched around the house. You want to take it from there?
Dusk was falling fast when he returned. I was so relieved to see him return safe. He started trying to calm me down and reassure me. He tried to convince me it could be a bear because everything can be explained. And maybe I should not repeat it to anyone else. I know he was only trying to protect me by his words. It took 2 years to finally have an answer, an idea of what it was that I encountered. Then a TV program came on called The Legend of Sasquatch. Then my dad said, "Sis, is that what you saw a few years ago?" I said, "Close enough." I have spent a lot of sleepless nights since that awful evening and have thought of what happened, and I wonder what would have happened if I would have reacted differently.
And I really like that because there's a lot of detail there. And it just comes across as very genuine and realistic for how would someone react.
Yes, and it's very much a close encounter. It is also a close encounter that is not framed by cultural contamination.
Right. And specifically that, it was, a couple of years later before it was like, oh, maybe this is it,
Yes.
This was not something that was on her radar or her dad's radar,
No.
Now, I mean, there are some accounts of creatures in the Ozarks that you would categorize as Bigfoot being more aggressive, chasing, etc. But this is interesting because it just really shows a curiosity, it seems to me.
It does. I wonder if that curiosity and that nonviolent approach had something to do with the fact that she was 12.
That I do too. She was not a threat, whereas, say, with the Blue Man, a group of loggers could be perceived as a threat to the territory or to members of their family, perhaps if they had children.
Yes. And it's quite possible this is one of the, just in terms of anecdotal documentation, one of the closest encounters. Is certainly one of the closest encounters that I've come across.
Yeah, me too. Usually, I've come across a handful where they're seen, at some distance, but close enough that the person could get quite a bit of detail of what they looked like. But to actually be so close that you could have reached out and touched him, I have no doubt she was terrified.
Yes. and things like the whites of the eyes being reddish, the pupils being a blue color, the reddish thick hair not being fur.
Mm-hmm.
These things are, to me, really, really fascinating. A commonality on this is, and I found this of particular note, something was not right and I could feel it.
And that is something that comes up in a lot of accounts, is that even before or even in absence of something happening, that you would say that that was aggressive behavior or that was threatening behavior. Often there's a sense that something is off, there's danger, even though you can't specify why yet.
Yes. Something really triggering that portion of our brain that often seems to lie dormant.
Well, and I think that goes back to, more primal instincts of when we were out there in the forest or in the caves or on the savannah and had to worry about whether we were going to be eaten.
Yeah.
And we still have those instincts, we just don't use them all the time.
Yes, until something triggers them. And it seems that the Bigfoot encounters is one of those things that consistently triggers that response.
Very often, even ones where they describe them as being very human-like, and I've read a couple of accounts where hunters had rifles trained on them and then did not shoot because they felt like this was something very human-like, but still describing that they were very afraid in that moment at the same time.
Yes. And having traveled a lot around these areas, places like Round Spring, Greer Spring, 11 Point, Current Rivers, these locations, if you it's one of the same, if you know in terms of how rugged and how dense this forest is. But if you are unfamiliar with this territory, it is difficult to describe just what it's like. It is almost a different world.
It is. And the flip of the coin on this, though, is that there are accounts of Sasquatch and Bigfoot in the areas of the national forest that are not quite as dense and remote as well.
Yes.
Toward the Cassville area, there's a number of reports that I have heard personally over the years, ranging from Berry County, the Cassville area, west into Newton County, into Jasper County.
Yes.
And some of these areas are not remote, and much more populated than, say, where this lady's experience happened, or say Donovan or Salem, etc.
Yes.
So, and one in particular that I investigated, that there was an indication that there was something very big there, with footprints that were very large and really were not human shaped, that were freshly made. So whatever is going on, it is wide ranging and not necessarily afraid to be around populated areas, I think, is one thing to note.
Correct. Which sounds contradictory, but that is only from our perspective, not from theirs.
That's true. I mean, they still, even in the more populated areas, are fairly adept at moving at night, or, through areas that aren't highly trafficked by people, which I think more than anything shows the level of intelligence.
I agree. I really do. There was a interesting report that came from the Salem area, Salem, Missouri area
Uh-huh.
fairly recently, specifically from David Prater, and saying that he affirms that in the sunlight, the Bigfoot has a bluish hue that appears as a halo around its short, dark, curly hair. And that's not terribly far removed from Blue Man.
No, it's not. I mean, I was even thinking, in the story from this woman from 67, with talking about the pupils of the eyes being bluish, if there's some pigmentation going on that seems to carry through in these different accounts.
It does, and it seems to be a very memorable pigmentation.
Yes. And then you have the ones that, you get reddish tint as well. But so, and I think that's one thing too, is that they're not all identical in
Yes.
appearance.
And
you had a report of one that was light colored, if I remember right.
yes, at least the potentiality of it, or of a cryptid that was cream colored.
Yeah.
And that, to an initial observer, researcher, the seeming contradictions could be a red flag. I think for you and I at this point, the fact that everything isn't being reported the same suggests actual experiences rather than pop culture contamination.
Exactly. Well, I mean, it's just walk down the street any day, and with humans, we have a lot of variation, and with hair, skin, etc. That if again, not everyone looks exactly alike.
No, and the quote from Mr. Reary in near Salem, I thought was really interesting. The Missouri Ozarks is a mysterious place. A lot of odd stuff happens here. It just might be that the world we see is not the world as it really is. I found that to be a very profound quote.
Well, and that applies to a lot of things that come up. That might be a good point to jump off to the next topic.
Werewolves.
Werewolves, Hellhounds. Not something you expect on your afternoon hike on a Saturday.
No, it is not. And we're gonna dive directly into territory that may touch upon three different categories: werewolves, hellhounds, and skinwalkers, in direct association with Mark Twain National Forest. And interestingly enough, if you do a web search, you will find these reports coming out now of hellhounds being seen.
Mm-hmm.
Now, just in terms of the phenomena, I want to ask you this: your thoughts on the definition of a hellhound. It has a lot of cultural baggage associated with it.
Yeah. Technically, I guess for it to be a hellhound, I would like to see something that would denote, something definitely otherworldly beyond, phantom hounds, which is something different. As far as I know, no one's been dragged to the nether regions or to another dimension, etc. I think for most people, they just associate big, scary-looking dog as hellhound.
Yes.
And I mean, I don't know of any accounts that show any behavior or something that happened that would make me think you have that sort of supernatural aspect to it, at least that kind.
Right. After repeated queries, Hell has still maintained its position of no comment.
That's correct. The spokesman is giving nothing else forthcoming.
Yes, but it's there are some interesting commonalities and a little bit of crossover with Bigfoot in this sense, and that is that when an individual, and I'll call them hellhounds for the moment, just for lack of anything else to call them. We call them a variety of things, but I'll call them hellhounds tonight. Upon encountering a hellhound, a commonality that appears to be in the case is that it's the idea of it's a very unsettling experience because something about all of it just does not seem right.
That's true, but on the other hand, these accounts of werewolves, which often the two are being used interchangeably, it seems, which is odd to me because werewolf is not a hellhound, vice versa, but you that would fit with both instances. And we had an account come to us through Dark Ozarks a few months ago,
Yes.
out of the Rolla area, generally, from a lady who had an experience. She was driving to work, driving along a 2-lane highway with forest around her. And she comes, as she's driving, she sees this very large, what looks like a dog or possibly a bear. She's coming up upon it. But as she gets closer, it looks canine. And then it starts running and basically chasing along with her car, but maintaining the speed. So it's running at an unnatural speed because she's going speed on the highway, this 2-lane highway. She's doing 55, 60 miles an hour. And it keeps up with her for at least a couple of miles. And she says that she's looking over at it, it turns its head and looks at her like it's noticing her, that it's specifically noticing her, which is the unusual part, like it was really aware of her. And this goes on long enough that she's very unsettled because it's maintaining speed with the car. And then after a couple of miles, it stops and just stands by the road as she drives on.
Yes.
And it left her unsettled, which, I mean, any creature that was running that fast for that long would certainly raise your interest. But it did leave her unsettled, and it felt like it was really aware of her, not just the car.
Yes. And this is, and first of all, there's a really interesting crossover between that report and our Great American Southwest Skinwalker reports.
Yes, that is true.
And the 2 points of commonality. First of all, the extreme speed.
Mm-hmm.
And as we're increasingly getting reports as Dark Ozarks has expanded, and the many of the reports that we get are solid reports. It's not just internet chatter.
Right.
These are individuals, and at times an almost commonplace referencing of things like, yes, it was chasing the car, and until I went past 60 miles an hour, it kept up.
Right. Which is enough to certainly, give you pause.
Very much so. The second is the statement, which I think until you experience it, you wouldn't really fully appreciate it, is the simple statement of, it looked at me and it was different.
Yeah. And that was the sense that she had. And and she said, basically that she kind of hoped that she didn't run across it again.
And of course, from a research standpoint, you think, okay, what sort of incredibly interesting data could be collected if you slowed the car down and stopped? But the other aspect of this potential reality is that everything about your being and your welfare is to say, under no circumstances do you stop, because suddenly, in a very weird and unanticipated sort of way, you feel that you are in danger.
Exactly. And of course, if you have something that has that kind of ability that is not expected, what else could it do?
Yes.
And are you safe in your car?
And you might not be. That is, I mean, that's not a great thing to say, but it is something just to take into consideration. Oftentimes, and not just with paranormal, but just in everyday life, difficult as it is, there are times we're not nearly as safe as we think we are.
Very true. Very, very true. And so what do you make of the sort of the morphing of these stories into werewolf stories?
Oh, there's a lot of moving parts. Certainly from a North American standpoint, our collected lore on skinwalkers, which since the advent of something called Skinwalker Ranch, has become part of pop culture as well. So there is pop culture contamination there.
Mm-hmm.
But throughout the Americas, there is interesting and correlative lore regarding shapeshifters.
Mm-hmm.
That is, and I'll be the first to admit, up until recently, I put all of this into fairy tale archetypal mythology.
Yeah.
It was not something that, yes, it's certainly not something that I took literally, not something that not saying I didn't take the archetypal potency of the lore seriously, but I did not take the literal lore seriously. And if you dig into more staid explanations, you essentially have shamans dressing up in animal pelts, getting high off of peyote and getting done with their dream quest and saying, wow, I turned into a coyote. And we've all agreed that I turned into a coyote. And that's where most of the discussion typically stops, up until you begin getting these reports that are so consistent over time, that are not individuals who are trying to get on TV. They're not trying to claim anything crazy. They're not trying to seek the spotlight. They're not doing any of these things. And some of these individuals, of course, are just everyday people. Some of them are uniquely credible sources involved with law enforcement, paramedic work, etc., and not people who were out trying to find crazy. This just occurred, and the crossover on that with so much of this lore is really fascinating. Again, abnormally sized canines acting in strange ways, running abnormally fast, appearing, sometimes walking on hind legs, making eye contact, looking at the person and having the person feel that they were looking at a human, these types of things that is aligned with Native American lore across the Americas of black magic shapeshifting. It is very odd.
It is, and I have to say, I pretty much was in the same spot you were for a very long time. But as we got more of these stories, I certainly gave it more literal credibility and not folkloric. And then I had my own experience earlier this year, which again, I was not, I wasn't out looking for anything at that point. Even though sometimes we do tend to go out looking for things, but
true. But when this happened, you were not looking for
no, I literally kind of like this one. I was driving down the road and just saw this creature that at first I thought, oh, that's a dog. Oh, that's a really big dog. And then but it was not proportioned correctly, even for a wolf. It was bigger than a wolf, which is really big. People who see coyotes, often think a wolf is about that size, but a wolf can be considerably bigger than a coyote. But this thing was, when it jumped onto the road, it had to be 5 to 6 feet long plus tail, with a massive head, and just the muscular structure was more massive.
yes.
Unusually long tail too, and definitely it stopped and turned and looked at me, and I feel silly saying it, but I had the feeling it knew it was looking at me.
Yes. And I just want get a little bit of clarification. The sense, and this is my understanding, but just so we know, the sense it was looking at you, not at your vehicle.
Yes. I mean, and that seems odd to me because, it would seem to me that it was just seeing, observing the car, and I had slowed and to turn, and ultimately stopped in the road when this jumped onto the roadbed. But yes, I got the sense it was looking at me, and we maintained eye contact for several seconds, and then it jumped off the other side of the road, and it had to jump a total of probably 20 to 25 feet flat-footed, both times. And the first time jumping from a low water onto a low water bridge with a height of probably, from where it had come up, about 6 feet, and clearing at least 20 feet, and
Yes.
landing on its feet, just like it had taken I mean, it just very easily. The whole movement just seemed unusual.
Yes.
And so I still don't know exactly what I saw.
Right. And there's experiences, encounters like this typically leave you with more questions than answers.
Yes.
And they, range from, and of course the our traditional Navajo lore, from what we are able to talk about, because one of the standards of safekeeping to protect yourself from skinwalkers is to not talking about skinwalkers, which makes a lot of this both interesting, a little eerie, and a little difficult, because what are we doing? We're talking about skinwalkers. But it, what we're theorizing is that we're dealing with black magic shamans who physically transform.
Right. And for those that aren't familiar, I mean, that part of the story is what pop culture is fixated on. Originally, they were warriors. And I forget the Navajo word, but it basically for fast running. And so they would use this magic to travel fast to get to a battle, to get back, or to deliver messages. And then the idea is that over time, they started using these abilities and this power, not for the community and for the good of the whole, but for selfish reasons. And that's what developed into the skinwalkers that we hear about now.
Yes, and some elements of that, this facet of potential history that we're looking at, really, to me, are very profound, because it is also a statement of the fracturing of society, the negative impact that the federal government had on Native culture by the creation of the reservations, etc. And that as communities were broken apart, the safeguards, the innate safety structures that had been in place for thousands of years were lost, and yet the potential capacity to engage in this kind of power remained.
Mhm. Exactly. And I think it's important to note that it's not something that was just limited to the Southwest. It's where it was most prevalent, but you have these accounts over a wide area.
And that wide area certainly is well into, and not throughout, rural Oklahoma.
Yes.
But now we're increasingly privy to access to solid anecdotal accounts happening throughout the Ozarks.
Mhm.
And of course, simply by proximity, in association with the Mark Twain National Forest. The other thing that I find really interesting, and of course this is tying to werewolf lore, and one of the things that is both helpful and problematic, is that we use language to describe things. Many of the times that many times that individuals say, like our account from July 1967 near Willow Springs, this 12-year-old girl did not have words to contextualize her experience.
Right.
Until later she was watching a TV show, and it says it's a Sasquatch. She goes, "That's close enough. Apparently I saw a Sasquatch." Our cross-cultural language usage, pop culture contamination, and sharing of information is a double-edged sword.
It is, because I think, like in the case of skinwalkers, people get the connotation that this is something that's limited geographically, which it is not necessarily, or at least, if not literally the same, a similar process of transformation.
Yes. And something that I think is positive is that the march to homogenize modernity and industrial civilization in some of these regions, including some of the regions here in the Ozarks, is less advanced, meaning less lore has actually been lost,
Mm-hmm.
than what we have seen in post-Renaissance industrialized Europe. That said, we have Germanic stories of anthropomorphic wolves, particularly in terms of wolf battle cults.
Yeah.
And we have, of course, the Norse stories of the berserkers, the
Mhm.
bear warriors, and bear is an animal, but also bare-skinned, going into battle without armor. And what I think is of particular note is that our overly rationalistic, overly scientific patina or artifice that gets plastered over everything has the exact same explanation for the warrior wolf cults of Germany, the bear spirit warriors of the Norse, and the black shaman or black magic shaman, the skinwalkers of the American Southwest, which is it's a fraternal cult or group that have gotten together, gotten really, really high, dressed themselves in animal skins, and then did silly things.
Mm-hmm.
And it does make me really wonder if those original late Middle Ages, early Renaissance reports that particularly were monastic documentations from Northern Europe were not actually documenting either the recent memory, comparatively recent memory, or actual experience of a full-on transmogrification.
It's, I mean, you know, it's possible in my thought. Some people will laugh at that, but
Which is fine.
which is fine. But lots of strange things have happened, and a lot of these situations you cannot discount the witnesses by saying, oh, they were drunk, they were high, they were this, they were that. They witnessed these things, and the mechanism for how it happened, we may not know exactly, or at least the people who do know how aren't saying.
Right. It is definitely hidden knowledge, and to a large degree that's okay. It's turning myself into a giant canine is not high on my to-do lists. Although being able to run 55 miles an hour would be really nice. That as said, let's talk a little bit about the Trail of Tears in the Irish wilderness.
Okay. And I think that's one thing that a lot of people are not really they don't think about too much with this part of the state and the forest, is that the Trail of Tears actually went through a lot of these areas because there wasn't just one route.
Correct. There was a number of.
But in particular, over by Donovan and Salem, there were areas that the Trail of Tears went through a lot, in Dent County, as well as the Cassville area.
Yes.
There's a good long section of Trail of Tears of the official route. And that's another thing people may not be aware that you had different types of migrations. You had some that were carried out by the military, by the army. You had Indian agents that relocated Native Americans as well.
Yes.
And so they went various ways. So when you say something happened on the Trail of Tears, it is kind of like the Mark Twain Forest itself, is that it's spread out. And just saying it was on the Trail of Tears in Missouri or southern Missouri, not only is it where was it east to west, it's how far north, how far south.
Agreed.
And so pinning things down helps. And then as you get over to the western side of the Ozarks, you get accounts of a paranormal nature, including the spook light along the Trail of Tears.
Yes. And I think that is, and I would hope that most of our listeners are familiar with the Trail of Tears, but it is a significant and unfortunate part of American history in the 1830s, with the forced removal of 20,000 plus Cherokee from traditional Cherokee lands in East Tennessee, West North Carolina, North Georgia,
Mm-hmm.
and forcing them to then at that time Indian Territory, modern day Oklahoma, where they would be put into direct proximity with additional tribes that were unfavorably disposed to the Cherokee as well. Oftentimes at points of great vulnerability, and many Cherokee died in transit. The U.S. government paid a lot of money to individuals and individual companies essentially to transit them.
Mm-hmm.
And a very deeply inhumane and really awful situation in which it was mass human trafficking
Mm-hmm.
in a very early time in American history, where the situation was, how do we move the largest, this is the amount that we get paid, how do we move the largest amount of people for the least amount of cost?
Right.
Overcrowding onto riverboats, having riverboat accidents as a result, with many drownings, forced marching through awful weather in vulnerable populations, elderly, children, etc., passing on the trails. And it came with its own cost, of course, and created a very complex situation, because many of the Cherokee who were forced to relocate to Oklahoma in the 1830s would remember just how much they hated the federal government in the 1860s, causing them often to fragment, and many portions of that fragmentation to side with the Confederacy, leading to very unique situations in places like the First Battle of Newtonia, where Union and Confederate Native Americans met in pitched battle, sometimes to the horror of the onlookers, because they were theoretically fighting for North and South, but in reality, they were settling scores that had dated back to previous Indian wars.
Yes. And that wasn't always apparent to everyone involved, but it certainly happened.
Yes. And
oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it really speaks. One of the things that when we cover the First Battle of Newtonia, Newtonia, Missouri, the complexities of the Native American conflict during that battle consistently surprise individuals who are not heavily familiarized with the nuances of this history. And I think that is really unfortunate, because it overlooks the fact that our Native American history, the Native American history that we're dealing with, is not monolithic. It's not, it is not cowboys versus Indians. We are dealing with incredibly complex and complicated human social structures that dated back for thousands of years, along with appropriate animosities and history of war amongst the tribes for a variety of reasons before the incursion of white settlement.
And, at the same time where the federal government was the impetus for the removal of the Trail of Tears, and certainly looking back was a bad actor. Ironically, in the years coming up to that point, the federal government had actually gone out of its way to help protect the Cherokee from
Yes.
some of these other tribes, particularly the Osage, who were quite aggressive towards the Cherokee. And as groups of Cherokee were moving west into the Arkansas Ozarks, the government would move the Osage further west, and eventually on into Oklahoma, because the Osage were so violent towards the Cherokee. It was a means, it was done to help protect the Cherokee. So all of these things are very complicated, and there are lots of nuances that a lot of times don't get talked about.
And it's unfortunate, and I think it's one of the really important reasons that regional histories are so crucial, because when you're dealing with things on a national scale, it's just incredibly difficult to dig into the complexities of human nature with these aspects. When you start bringing it down onto the regional level, state level, and then sub-state level, it begins to come alive. I was just curious, with the Trail of Tears, in addition to the spook light, what if any of paranormal activity have you heard of or worked with?
There are a couple of places in Berry County that there's supposed to be potential hauntings along the trail, that may or may not be from people who passed during the march. But I've heard them sort of secondhand accounts, and not in detail enough for me to say, yes, I think it specifically was tied to the Trail of Tears and not maybe some other event or other natives living in the area another time, but potentially related to that, because hauntings involving sounds of native ceremonies or singing, as well as apparitions, have been seen where the trail went through.
Yes.
But is it because of the trail, or was that already there? I'm not sure.
Right. And even just is something that we've noted with a number of investigative hauntings, just the outputting of extreme emotion can seem to create some sort of residual that echoes
Exactly.
across time.
Exactly. And so it could be related to the trail and it not even be a death,
Yes.
just the emotion involved,
Although,
or could be something different altogether.
Right. But we do know documentably that a lot of deaths occurred along the trail.
Yes. So those accounts are ones that I think are potentially related to it. But
yes, and I think, to me, that this particular element of our history is incredibly important. There's a lot of ways that you can look at it in terms of paranormal investigation, and of course folks are all over the place in terms of their opinions of paranormal investigation. But if you're listening to Dark Ozarks, I'm assuming you're interested, but that's just a hunch. But I think that there of course are right ways and wrong ways to do many things, and to me, investigations along these lines, the most important takeaway, regardless of what evidence or accounts are or are not gathered, if we can remember these people, the
Yes.
lives that they lived. If we can remember essentially the pain that they went through and learn from that and honor their experience in the best way possible, that gives some of that pain from the past meaning. And I
I
think
think so.
that to me is incredibly important. The pain of our past mistakes, the pain of our past ancestors, as well as what individuals are currently going through. I think one of the things that that human beings struggle with across the generations is a sense of, what does it mean? Does it mean anything?
Yeah.
And to me, this type of history, this type of research says, yes, your experiences and your suffering will not be in vain.
I agree with that. And I think it's something that if people do think about more, there tends to be a more understanding of other people.
Yes, in all directions, in
Mhm.
all directions. And I think that is incredibly important. Now, an interesting mystery that has a lot of moving parts is the Irish wilderness.
Yes. And the wilderness ended up being on the edge of Dent County, close to Ripley County, I believe. And actually in area where the Trail of Tears went through part of it. So basically you had relocation on the Trail of Tears through this land in the 1830s, and then basically 20 years later, roughly, you have a colony of Irish settlers coming from St. Louis to basically start anew. And there's some parallel there, I think, because while the Irish were not being forced to move, they had encountered a lot of prejudice and discrimination in St. Louis.
Yes.
There had been a large influx of Irish in the St. Louis area because of the famine, the potato famines, and they were not well received. I think mainly because it was such a large number of people coming in at once, and it fanned those flames of distrust of immigrants, etc., that unfortunately our country goes through from time to time.
Yes.
And so a group of about 40 families ended up relocating to start a new settlement, basically through the guidance of the Catholic Church and Father John Hogan. And he was instrumental in securing the property and organizing it. And it's a bit like the Roanoke colony in that, where Governor White brings the colonists, including his daughter and son-in-law, and he has to go back to England, comes back to Roanoke, and they're all gone. Literally, that's what happened with Father Hogan.
Yes. And it's in modern terms, it's really difficult for us to wrap our heads around, because we have we have FaceTime. We have cell service. We have all of these things, except in the Irish wilderness, which you do not. So not
Even
much.
today, that's right.
I, I was I was there in April and went, wow, I can no longer use my GPS right now. Let me just cross my fingers, hope for the best. That they're, in a situation of the span of about 4 years, um, a homestead settlement community can go from existent and thriving to simply gone. And
by a lot of accounts with no trace.
yes, and to some degree, communication being so poor that many people in the region might not even have noticed or heard about it, or and to me this really speaks of the bravery and the danger of early settlement, because you are transitioning into a space with no backup. There's nobody that you're going to call for help.
Exactly. And timing was not in their favor. They, the colony, they first started securing land and everything in 1858. Basically the colonists were there by 1859 and things going well. Father Hogan went back several times and things were thriving. And actually, the settlers were becoming fairly prosperous, which may have been part of their downfall in the end. And then the war broke out.
Yes.
And at first, it's interesting because at first, Hogan and other church leaders, they were being told, oh, they should be fine, because they really didn't think that area was going to be of interest to the Confederates. That's what they're being told in St. Louis. And basically, they ended up dead center in crossfire between the Union and Confederates in the area. And not to mention, the Union commando that tended to hunt Confederates. I just went blank on. I just went blank on his name. Can't believe I can't think of his name. And that was the area he operated in as well. So it's hard to know.
It is. It really is. As you noted, Hogan was under the impression that nobody really cared enough about this area to put the settlement at risk. And
exactly,
that really wasn't the case. You had the northern reaches of modern day Irish wilderness, which is in the Mark Twain Forest, being Union Army, the southern and southeastern portions being Confederate Army officially. We had just a couple of routes through this space, and the settlement was within immediate proximity of one of those routes. And then you had bushwhackers operating, which are essentially bandits operating within the wilderness. And then you also had the difficult terrain actually being a magnet of sorts of anybody trying to get away from someone going into
war.
getting into that rough terrain in order to lose pursuit or simply not be followed. So it is a unique storm of conflict within what was a very, very rugged, and is a very rugged and remote region.
Yes. And it got so dangerous that basically Hogan was ordered not to go check on them anymore. And so there's various accounts of what may have happened. But basically, by the time things were safe enough to go check on them, there was no sign of anybody, and officially no one was ever heard from again. Some
Yeah.
people will rationalize, oh, they probably just moved, when things got, heated and dangerous, that one, a group at a time or family at a time probably just left. And some may have, but on the other hand, it seems odd that none of them, unless they all died before they got established somewhere else, never sent a letter to Hogan or their backers in St. Louis to say, hey, here's what happened, or here's where we are.
Yes.
There are tales of the settlers having buried money around the settlement to safeguard against bushwhackers, and the armies for that matter at times, and that perhaps they were killed over the money or just in the matter of fighting.
Yes.
On the other hand, if that happened, they didn't find any graves and they didn't find any remains, so that there was no evidence of people being killed on site either.
Right. Right. So it is a lost colony at this point, at this juncture point.
Yeah, it really is reminiscent of Roanoke.
Yes. Yes. And having traversed portions of the Irish wilderness, it is a unique space.
Yes. I've been through there a couple of times, not really explored it, but just driven in the general area. To give people an idea of how remote it was and how lost things could be, it was another 15 years after the war before they figured out where the church was so they could sell the property for back taxes.
Yes. Yes.
And so that gives an idea of how, how cleanly swept the ground was of the settlement.
Yes.
And that's the part that's hard to believe.
It is. It is. And it's heartbreaking in the sense of these individuals and what they were attempting to do.
It really is. And, it might have turned out much differently if it hadn't been for the war. But it is a mystery that probably will never get a full answer.
Right. And I think just in terms of mysteries, and this may be our last topic for tonight, I really want to get your thoughts on this. This has its own sort of subculture of conspiracy on the internet. It is associated directly with the Mark Twain National Forest, and that is the Missouri Mystery Mound.
Yes. It is one of those things that is very reminiscent of the Metal Library, and is it Costa Rica and some other supposedly lost treasures. That basically this started out, became known from a fellow named Charles Teague. And there's a little bit of vagueness and through part of this, but basically that he found a mound near Cape Girardeau that had various artifacts and carvings and everything that appeared to be very old, in almost a some of it seemed from the description almost a Mayan influence.
Yes.
Which now they have more evidence that the Mayan culture had spread to present day United States, at least into Georgia and Florida. So I guess it's possible. But basically, there's steps to the account. He goes back and that he can't find the entrance is blocked, and that he feels the government is hiding this information and so forth. And that's where it really gets into the conspiracy theory aspect. Did they find something? It's entirely possible. There's certainly enough mounds in the region, and mound building civilization was throughout this area. So that's entirely possible.
Yes. There are a lot of there the story as it has been told, there are a lot of direct lines being drawn that do not, that the even the evidence presented does not necessarily validate the lines that were drawn.
I agree. And one of those that I found interesting is that Teague made the conclusion that General George Morgan, who was a general in the Revolution, basically had something to do with the mound, or had discovered it and perhaps concealed the location or misdirected. And the ABC of his logic is a little tenuous, but basically George Morgan was sent by George Washington to map this part of North America.
Yes.
And he ultimately founded Cape Girardeau, Missouri. And Teague says that he saw a engraving of what looked like some sort of grid system in the mound, and he saw it in papers talking about George Morgan, and so he associated Morgan with it.
Yes.
And that somehow that drawing would take you to the mound. Well, but the problem is when you look at the drawing that Teague references, what it is the original plat of Cape Girardeau that Morgan made. It's identical. So by that logic, the mound would be somewhere within the original part of Cape Girardeau, which by Teague's own testimony, it wasn't.
It is. There's and I want to again put my disclaimer on this. The potential of all sorts of incredible things being buried and lost in the forests of this region, as well as many other regions, but particularly this region, is the propensity for that is not impossible. It is, we're not out of the realm of possibility here.
No.
And something that I find really positive about this story is that it begins to highlight something that I think might almost exist within our genetic or ancestral memory on some sort of weird level, which is the Hopewell Mississippian culture was a vast and sophisticated civilization that stretched across this area of Missouri and Oklahoma, across southern Illinois, into Kentucky, into the Ohio River Valley, and with
Mhm.
many, many sacred sites along the Ohio River in southern Ohio. So essentially stretching from, can't believe I'm going to reference this cryptid, stretching from Mothman past the spook light. There you go. And even to, you know, and specifically the ceremonial site of Spiro Mound in
Yeah.
Oklahoma. And so we have incredibly sophisticated of civilization, and incredibly sophisticated civilization of which we know very little. And the
Mhm.
mounds are evidence of that.
Yes.
And so I think any type of story that highlights this is really, really fascinating. The alleged connections of this proposed Hall of Records is tenuous at best. And the stories, as they are reported, as you mentioned, you look at the logic that's associated and you say, there's this bit of information, and then there's this bit of information. And we have this documentation that says, and then Teague said, it couldn't have been anything else. And I'm going, well, it could be a lot of other things else, actually. Yeah. And one of my favorites is that when Morgan, sort of after mapping out and kicking off New Madrid, then leaves and goes back home to his estate. And and one of T's conclusions is he must have found treasure, because how else could he have done this? And apparently records show that his rather wealthy brother, who was a doctor, passed away and willed him enough money for an estate. Yes. So I think there's some really really positive things here, but also some cautionary tales about making rapid leaps of logic that may or may not be sustainable. That said, is there, you know, I find the connections of a connective or Mayan-like culture civilization in North America that predated the contemporary tribes that that we're familiar with or more familiar with. Could those peoples have had transatlantic transit or communication that is at times implied, but in the mid 20th century got shunned in terms of potential? This is there in Missouri does seem to be an interesting focal point. We have a number of reports that are surprisingly credible of just in terms of lost history, or let's see, what's the word I'm looking for? History adjacent, accepted history adjacent artifacts, accepted history adjacent artifacts being sent to locations and disappearing with no forwarding address.
Yes.
And somebody should have saved the receipt on that giant skeleton that got shipped off, because it disappeared. Yes. And I think innately many of us have some sort of resonance in the fact that there's more to the story. There is more interesting things, and from the potential of lost Welsh explorers wandering into the heartland of the Americas, to even more recently because there's the possibility that in 1541, Hernando de Soto's men made it possibly to the current river in Missouri. And it's, I think, very important that we not immediately dismiss or immediately scoff at some of these possibilities simply because it doesn't fit a neat and tidy narrative.
I agree, and that is the one thing with Teague's account, is that it's like, if he stopped short of where he went, he started hurting his own case, because could he have stumbled upon such a mound? Yes. When he went back and he claimed, basically went back and the entrance was caved in or filled in, and he was intercepted by a couple of official acting men who he assumed were with the government. And we start going down that conspiracy theory road, that somehow the government's covering this up and basically burying the mound so people can't find it. Where on the other hand, it could very logically have been, maybe there was a mound, maybe the entrance just naturally caved in from time, and leave it at that. And he couldn't find it.
Yes, there's a lot of awesome moving parts, including a humanoid reptilian god.
Yes, I forgot that part, but yeah.
The Corps of Engineers covering it all up.
Mm-hmm.
The people in the woods protecting the place, thinking that it may have been maybe a pagan cult from long ago.
Okay.
The Hall of Records has a giant skull carved into it. It's associated with the planet Saturn. There's it may be a possible location of the Holy Grail.
You're out of luck, Oak Island.
And it all started with Art Bell.
Well, no, he went on Art Bell's show. Yes. So, yeah. And again, there's a grain in there that could be very realistic, but at least at this point, the puffing has not helped the credibility.
No. The basic story of the Mystery Mound really begins and ends, of course, with Charles Teague. Teague was researching for clues to a possible location of the Holy Grail in North America when he caught an interview with a Native American shaman on Art Bell's radio show.
Yeah.
The shaman claimed to have been exploring when he was approached by another Native American, and this stranger blindfolded the shaman and led him to a place in the deep woods, which contained a hall of records under a mountain. It apparently also encompassed many ancient artifacts, and upon recollection, the shaman claimed he did not know the exact location of these treasures, but was positive of an approximate location. But so far, I don't believe we've actually mentioned Missouri. And Teague was so fascinated, according to this account, that he not only began to research it, but he got all of his, but Teague recorded the entire interview with the shaman and then did a reverse playback on the interview to find the hidden clues of the location.
Was he listening to a Beatles record at the time backwards?
Yes. Well, I don't know that part. I'm not at liberty to officially conjecture. It is of course, first of all, I think it's an extraordinary lesson in how we arrive at a variety of conclusions.
Yes, and different people arrive at them differently.
Yes. I think that, and this is something just talking about the importance of how to approach investigative research, etc., is yes, we all have things that we would like to be true.
Mm-hmm.
We all have things that we are interested in. I think that from a Jungian archetypal perspective, the things that resonate for real reasons. But we cannot always get, and oftentimes cannot get, a 1-to-1 ratio on what resonates for very important reasons to what is physically documentable in the field.
Very true.
And in terms of research, in terms of doing valid research, I think it's very important, first of all, to understand that bias exists because we're simply human beings. We cannot have an unbiased opinion about the rats in the maze because we also are the rats in the maze. But it is very powerful to realize that we are also the rats in the maze and then observe data.
That self-insight is crucial to the process. Just if there were, a few more facts there to go along with that story, it would go a long ways. And so, there's enough circumstances that, okay, something could be plausible, but at this juncture, I'm reserving conclusion.
Yes. There are many things that I am skeptical of. Now, this is where I think that it's an important divergence, because I'm not discounting the cultural importance of the narrative.
No, I'm not either.
And this is something I really have a lot of fun with myself. So like one of my conclusions on this is whether, first of all, the account as it stands is difficult to believe.
Yes.
I'll put that out there and then just leave it right there. Let y'all go look up Missouri Mystery Mound and see what y'all's thoughts are on that. Yeah. That said, I think that there are multiple first of all, multiple important narratives and important narrative truths that are undercurrents of the story. And one of them is the aforementioned cultural importance of the Hopo Mississippian people and that sophisticated civilization that I think we almost have a genetic memory of. It sounds perhaps sacrilegious to say for myself without Native American ancestry, right, to say that I could have a genetic memory of that. But certainly there's something resonating there that you just outside the peripheral vision where you go, I know there's more. I know there's more here. And it meant something. Let's explore. And something that I found really interesting, just digging into the General Morgan story and the platting and settlement in New Madrid and this entire situation at a really key moment in embryonic United States history, when we were between the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution, and pretty much everyone was on tenterhooks waiting to see if the Constitution was actually going to work and we were going to be a country. That you have Morgan, who's out here freewheeling with the Spanish government, establishing, and then also just the fact that something, again, speaking of infrastructure, something that we take for granted, the land platting, the mapping, the settlement, the where do the streets go, where do the roads go, where do all of these things happen? This didn't happen by happenstance. It happened by an enormous amount of effort, sometimes great failure, financial failure, and sometimes incredible wealth. And there were specific key players engineering this process, engineering the infrastructure settlement of a new state or a new territory, and arguing immensely, and probably, working themselves up into a frenzy and occasionally having heart attacks and dying from the stress of going, how do we organize this stuff? And then a couple of generations later, or 100 years later, we're like, oh, just turn left on George Washington Street.
Yeah, exactly. And then of course he's the one who started the ball rolling by sending Morgan out here. So
yes. So we did indeed turn left on George Washington Street, literally and figuratively.
Exactly. And see, there's connection with George Washington to the Ozarks. So
yes, absolutely.
Now, I think we ought to, before we end, talk just a little bit about the forest itself.
Yes.
And the magic of trees.
One of my favorite subjects.
I had a feeling.
Yeah. Well, of course, speaking of, not seeing for the forest for the trees, sometimes you don't see the trees for the forest. That's true. Is and something that is often lost, because I don't think that we really have a consensus in terms of a shared common language of consensus about this sort of magical folklore. We have varying elements. And so what we're left with in terms of the official authorized sources is the rather bland scientific aspects of plant details and that sort of thing. Might surprise people to know that I do have actually quite strong background in horticulture. So I'm reasonably well versed in this sort of thing, all the way down to a lot of the Latin plant names. And that
which makes it witchcraft, by the way.
Yes.
Which makes it witchcraft, by the way, for most people.
and for the record, I'm good with that. But there's an enormous amount of magical lore, both in North America and in Europe, and then with European settlement, that lore mixed.
Yes.
Sometimes surprisingly similarly and effectively in association with, for example, some of the rural Scots-Irish interacting with the Cherokee and essentially comparing notes. But in essence, we have, just taking trees, not even going off onto plants, but just taking trees, we have trees as potent magical symbols. We have them as medicinals. We have them as healing herb medicinals, but also as guides, as spirits, as living ancestors, in a sense, that are associated with sacred spaces, both from a North American shaman tradition as well as from a Druidic tradition.
What tree in particular do you think in the Missouri Ozarks exemplifies that?
It would be the oak.
Okay.
For in terms of cross-cultural singularity, and in part because our oak species are so prolific, in the
Mhm.
Ozarks. They always have been. Certainly since the Cenozoic era, which is, said to be 29.2 million years ago. So apparently oaks have been around for a long time. That from an herbalistic standpoint, they have a great history. From a druidic standpoint, they have an extraordinarily great history. They have a hoodoo tradition, and then they figure predominantly in many Native American tribe stories, the Seneca, the Sioux, etc. And the oaks across the board are incredibly majestic and notable trees. The white oak in particular, even here in the thin soil of the Ozarks, can still become a massive and ancient tree.
Yeah. And what quality do you think, magical quality do you think they portray in the forest?
Well, I to me, certainly just from an intuitive standpoint, oaks represent strength, but more than that, they represent ancient wisdom. They represent a knowing that, I think is indicative of the fact that we're dealing with a living thing that could easily be 200 years old, in some cases much more.
And maybe that's part of some of these mysteries in the Mark Twain forest, is that it is a knowing, a knowledge of things ancient, that despite our inroads, despite our intrusions into the forest, has not been revealed.
Yes.
And maybe for good cause.
And quite possibly, we have the legends of the dryads. We have the legends of things in the forest. And the commonality of the forest, I mean, even by very definition of the forest, the thing that makes the forest a forest, and consequently by direct implication makes it magical, are the trees.
That's true. And we still have new tales coming out of those trees in the forest, which I find fascinating. We aren't just talking about mysteries and tales that happened, eons ago and have been handed down. This is evolving. Just example of the Hellhound and Werewolf tales that are coming out. It's ever changing. Even though the forest stays much the same, it's, the things within it, the things that lurk within it that perhaps are beyond our common experience seem to be evolving or changing.
They are, and I think it's our understanding that's rotating about the phenomena. I think the phenomena simply is, and our capacity to understand it shifts with each generation. Sometimes with the complex inundation of data, but other times simply within our capacity to understand things.
I think so, and that might be a good point to end on. We want to remind everyone not to forget to check out upcoming events and merchandise at darkozarks.com and paranormalsciencelab.com. Thank you again to Always Buying Books and Beard Engine Brewing Company for helping to bring the Dark Ozarks to everyone.
And on the next episode, we're going to be discussing dark tales from the Queen City of the Ozarks, Springfield, Missouri. Catch the Dark Ozarks podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and other podcast platforms. Thank you to everyone. And remember, there are no easy answers in the Dark Ozarks.